Good day. This is Greg Krasovsky. I'm an attorney, a political scientist, political commentator, human rights advocate, former police officer, former fire rescue technician, emergency medical services technician. Anyway, all those things aren't completely relevant, but it gives you a bit of a background. This video is going to discuss a post that I put up on my blog, which is called the Ukrainian-Russian-American Observer. And the post is called Glory to Past, Present, and Future Foreign Agents in Georgia, Ukraine, Armenia, Moldova, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan? Question mark. And the answer is no. There should not be glory to foreign agents. I put up this post because I read a tweet by a couple of Georgian ladies who had seen the protests. So in front of Georgia's parliament in Tbilisi, where you had what's called a geo rock band loudspeaker, I think, performing. They decided to work up the crowd and say cool things like, "Hey, glory to Ukraine, glory to Georgia, F Russia," things like that, and the crowd cheered. And that actually made me pretty sad because for as long as I remember, for all of my life, it's thanks to my parents, who were both dissidents, by the way, in their respective countries, and who studied at Moscow State University in the former Soviet Union. I've always been for an advocate for true democracy, which is government for the people, by the people, more importantly, for the people, right? And for independence and sovereignty of countries, especially smaller countries that can be very vulnerable to political influence, colonization, and control by bigger countries. So I looked at Georgia, and I've been keeping track of what's been happening in Georgia since 1991. I remember after the fall of the Soviet Union, when you had uh, the first movements for independence emerge in Abkhazia. Although, from what I understand, at that time, the percentage of Abkhazia's population that was Abkhaz was a minority. But they were afraid to end up in independent Georgia because they were afraid that they would be discriminated against by ethnic Georgians, who apparently constitute the majority of the residents of Abkhazia. I remember the independence movement that started in South Ossetia, same issue, although from what I understand from talking to Georgians who lived in Tskhinvali, that the percentage of Ossetians who lived in Tskhinvali wasn't that great either. But same thing, ethnic Ossetians were afraid that if they remained in Georgia without the protection of the Soviet Union and central government, they would be discriminated against, persecuted, and worse. So they opted for independence. You had an independence movement that started and was peacefully resolved in Nigeria, with its capital of Batumi on the Black Sea. But that's a problem of multi-ethnic states whose borders were often artificially created for political reasons. Back in the 19th century by imperial powers, and then in the 20th century, when the Soviet Union was created, when Soviet republics were demarked on the map, and then after World War II, we've been through all this. And I've always been a human rights defender for ethnic minorities. Just because you're an ethnic minority doesn't give the ethnic majority the right to discriminate against you, consider you second-class citizens and things like that. So what does this have to do with the foreign agent law? For the young generation of Georgians who probably don't speak Russian anymore, and consider Russian, from what I hear, a colonial language, But the Soviet Union was not a colony. Remember, it was not a colonial power. The Soviet Union was a political entity that was run by the Communist Party. Uh, High-ranking members of which were also happened to be Georgians, like Stalin, Zhugashvili, like the last Soviet foreign affairs minister, Shirinadze, who then went on to become the president of Georgia. So get your history straight and don't let people rewrite history for you for their political reasons. But please understand the following. If you want an independent Georgia that's a sovereign country whose government is accountable to the citizenry of Georgia, you better make sure that you have laws in place, like the foreign agent law, that will prevent foreign interference. Regardless of whether it's foreign interference coming from Russia, from Ukraine, remember Saakashvili, yeah, citizen of Ukraine these days, from the European Union, other NATO countries, including the United States and Great Britain. Why you don't want foreign interference? Well, let's think about what foreign money does to a smaller country's political system. You guys, I hope you understand how the world works. Sadly enough, even in countries that profess to be the cradles of democracy, their governments have been corrupted and co-opted by big money. It's extremely difficult to resist big money. Resist both morally, resist financially, and resist from an organizational point of view. Because when you have individuals, families, financial industrial groups, and these financial industrial groups are now transnational, they have holdings throughout the world. They have offshore holding companies, structures in many different jurisdictions. They have diversified their investments and their assets. So their well-being and their wealth is no longer at risk in any one particular country, whether it's the United States, whether it's the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Switzerland, you name it. These are transnational financial industrial groups who have assets worth trillions of dollars, trillions of euros. Okay? Trillions, not billions, trillions. Consider what the GDP for Georgia is. Consider what your entire nation's budget is. Now imagine if a financial industrial group, right, or an organization of these groups, right, a collaboration of these groups, decide to make a decision that it's in their best interest, whether it's long-term or short-term, to bring Georgia under their control. Perhaps not for Georgia's wealth. Georgia does not have, trillions worth of natural resources. It doesn't have oil. It doesn't have gas. Some pipelines do pass through Georgia, right? Georgia may not have the biggest deposits of various metals, including precious metals or precious stones. Georgia is a small country, but it happens to neighbor Russia, okay? And with all the ensuing consequences. So if, let's say, a financial industrial group or a very cooperative make a decision that it's in their best interest to bring your government under control, here's what's going to happen. Let's say they allocate $10 billion for a group of these figs. $5 billion is what we call in the United States chump change. It's not a lot of money. Guess what $5 billion will do to your political system? And just to make sure, like I said, I told you before, money runs the world. Back in the day, centuries ago, maybe even thousands of years ago, wealthy families, right? Because back then things were owned by families. You didn't have joint stock companies, corporations, you had family. who often would set up partnerships with other families or joint ventures. And then they set up various companies, right? Or enterprises. But families who were wealthy realized that the biggest threat to their wealth was not the mob. Local villagers or who were dissatisfied with the way they ran things feudally, because the mob could always be controlled. The mob could always be put into place with private armies, private security, right? Private guards, things like that. But the power that could take everything away from you was the sovereign, the government. Back then, you had empires that were run by emperors, Caesars in Rome. In the Dark Ages, you had local feudal kings. You also had the Holy Roman Empire. Your king could take your wealth away because he had the power of the state at his disposal. And the power of the state means he had an army. He had judges that would do what he told them to do, right? He would even have the local church at his disposal because often organized religions became subservient to their sovereigns. And the sovereign could even control the church because he knew how religion could be used to radicalize people and to even get them to sacrifice their lives for the greater good or in the name of God and overthrow a king or overthrow any particular wealthy noble. So the smart, wealthy families said, hey, what's the best way for us to protect our assets and our lives? Because back then they didn't just take away your assets, they would then kill you and kill your kids to make sure they wouldn't extract any revenge. What's the best way for us to protect ourselves against arbitrary or intentional government seizure, confiscation, nationalization, as we call it these days? Well, we have to control the sovereign. That's the only way you can do it, right? How do you control the sovereign? Well, threatening a sovereign is never a good thing. If you try to take away my wealth, we're going to have spies within your royal court who poison you. That doesn't get you far, okay? And very dangerous. Not to mention, how are you going to make sure that these people will do what you tell them to do? Because who wants to risk their neck and their entire family's lives trying to poison a king, right? At the request of a wealthy noble whose wealth has already been confiscated. Well, I guess you could try to make an arrangement with a competing king who would act as a guarantor, but that's also a very shaky premise. Because kings can make deals among themselves to take your wealth away, divvy it up, and that's the end of it. So what they realized is you have to control the government by controlling the sovereign, and you control them through finance. Okay? You either buy them with money, you give them money, you buy them with money, we call it bribes, we call it corruption, lobbying, whatever, or you control them through debt. You make sure that they're indebted to you. But then, being a creditor is also a dangerous situation because if you don't have the money to pay back your creditor, but you have the means to get rid of your creditor, then you could do that. And what would happen to the loan? That's the end of the loan, right? No more creditor, no more loan obligations. So in order to be able to do that, you really needed to have a transnational approach where a king knew that if he owed money to your transnational group that had a presence in different countries, if he were to take unlawful, immoral measures against the local creditor, that local creditor's relatives in other countries would petition their kings to take care of that king, to put him in his place, right? So potentially through military means and other political pressure, right? You could also control sovereigns. For instance, if your children started marrying into the royal family and now you have this intertwining of finance and financial assets, royal blood, and things like that. And we've seen that in countries. But we're not talking about the old days. We're talking about the 20th century. In the 20th century, we have supposed democracies where the electorate, people will vote for someone to put them in their place. They vote for candidates that are nominated by political parties. And they go through primaries. The political party selects their candidate, nominates him. He runs against candidates from other political parties, and formally the electorate elects him. But that democratic process can be easily managed with big money. It's easy. Why? Well, look, let's say if you're a large financial industrial group with assets of trillions, what do? You buy up local newspapers, mass media, news media, to make sure that the candidate that you want, your candidate, who's in your pocket, or whose party is controlled by you financially, gets favorable coverage. And all the news outlets, newspapers, TV stations, magazines, this is before the internet. Now we even have social media. They're all going to give favorable coverage to their candidate. And the other guy is going to be vilified, demonized if necessary, called the most incompetent, corrupt, blah, 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 whatever. Right? And that's how you can manipulate the electorate into supporting your candidate. Through mass media, through news media, also through non-government organizations that are going to, as they say, rally the vote. They're going to work on voters to convince them that their country or their particular state or their province or their city needs this candidate in office, either as a mayor, senator, congressman, representative in the local parliament. We have other key elected offices in the U.S. For instance, the sheriff, right, who enforces court decisions, and often in certain U.S. jurisdictions will also be the chief law enforcement officer as well, right? Prosecutors get elected in the U.S. and they're nominated by just two parties. Okay, and the U.S. is the cradle of democracy, right? This is what you guys are waving American flags for. I'm an American citizen, but guess what? I believe in the Constitution, right? I don't believe in government corruption. I'm willing to defend my country, to defend my Constitution, but I'm not going to defend my country when I know it's doing something wrong abroad, like it has many years throughout its, since it was founded in 1776. The majority of America's years have been spent with wars abroad, which is already a bad omen, bad sign. Okay. So you have these financial industrial groups that control governments because they buy up political parties, they buy politicians. And as I've said before, if you've read some of my articles on the Ukrainian-Russian-American Observer, or you've seen some of my videos, politicians are prostitutes. And I hate to use that type of language. And I also don't want to insult prostitutes, but their profession is what it is. You give a politician money and he will do what you tell him to do. If you give him enough money, he can be bought. He can be bought to act even against the interests of his own people, of his own electorate, people who live in his neighborhood, in his city, in his region, and in his country, for money, if you give him enough. Depends on the individual. Other people are corrupted through other ways. Some people are corrupted through the vices that they have, whether it's a drug addiction, whether it's alcohol addiction, whether it's just, sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies. There's a great Polish sociologist, Ponorowski, who wrote a great book about how sociopaths rise through the political system. And as far as he was concerned, comes to probably the majority of politicians because, their conscience is, what would be the word? It's been numbed if it exists, and they're pursuing their own egoistic agendas. Once you've controlled politicians and political parties, obviously you're going to control eventually public officials who are elected or who are appointed. So that means you're going to control the heads of all government agencies through money. Okay. The next step is you're going to control senior civil servants who have been appointed or who have risen through the ranks of the civil service system. They call that the deep state, right? So these are individuals who may be deputies of various agencies, because usually the heads are appointed by either the prime minister or the president, with often the parliament's approval. And by the way, when you control a government, you control all its branches. You don't just control who gets elected and who holds positions of power in the executive branch. You also control who gets elected and who holds positions of power in the legislative branch, your parliament, your Congress, right? Your Senate. And therefore, you have lawmakers, legislators who are going to write up and draft laws that are favorable to you. The executive branch doesn't, well, it can nominate, it can also draft laws that it submits to Parliament, but its job is actually to run the country and to enforce the laws, including through its various ministries, Ministry of Justice, the government prosecutor's office. So you also control prosecutors. And those prosecutors are not going to exercise what's called selective prosecution. And if necessary, they're going to turn a blind eye on things or give people that you want favorable treatment. That's what happens when you have a prosecutor in your pocket. In countries where judges are appointed or judges are elected, same thing. You buy favorable judges with money, okay? Judges that have a particular outlook on how certain cases should be resolved will have, for instance, a pro-business bias, or in key cases will definitely vote for people who pull their party's purse strings, not necessarily people who are directly bribing the judge. Listen, that's old world. Nobody's interested in direct bribery, people deliver cash in a paper bag, because that's primitive and you can get caught for that. What people like is legalized bribery, where they can't even put you in jail for this. Because what you've done is you've created various structures, right? Various middlemen that funnel your money into the political system. And it's all legitimate. In the US, we have political action committees, right? That can be funded by wealthy individuals, by their companies. Okay. Even if you have limits on individual contributions to candidates or parties, those limits are easily circumvented when you have political action committee money. Like I've said before, you have non-government organizations, including nonprofits, that do nothing but advance the interests of people who fund them. Okay. And they can use all sorts of banners. They'll even use banners of, human rights defense, or spreading democracy, freedom, and liberty throughout the world. Or creating a worldwide economic free market for the benefits of the global economy. By the way, you guys should realize that if you're a small country, you may need some protectionist measures to protect your local industry that can be quickly bankrupted by larger foreign competitors through price dumping. Okay? They can afford to do that if their shareholders, which are these large financial industrial groups, and the huge funds that they control. Look at some of the big funds that control most of the Fortune 500 companies in the US. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street Capital. Look at large private equity funds that have huge holdings in the military industrial complex. Remember Carlyle Group? Look it up. And you're going to see that big money can control governments. By the way, when big money controls a government, it also controls its law enforcement, its domestic security agency. So if you think your domestic security agency is working for the benefit of the people, you're mistaken. When its leadership, the rank and file certainly is, they're patriotic, just like regular soldiers are usually patriotic. But the top level people know who they're reporting to. They're not just reporting to the president or the prime minister, because the president and the prime minister is, for all practical purposes, a hired manager who's been nominated and put into place by these financial industrial groups. So the top level management of all these agencies and government departments, including the Department of Defense, including your domestic security service, your foreign intelligence agency, foreign intelligence service, your agency that does, intercepts of electronic communications like the National Security Agency. These people know who they report to, at least their leadership does. Because if they ever go out of control, they're going to be quickly taken out of office. Right? As they say, one way or the other. You're going to be given an offer that you can't refuse. And if you start refusing it, well, they'll find ways to fire you and cause to fire you. And if necessary, you'll have a heart attack or, heaven forbid, an auto accident or anything else. Or, the suicides where people shoot themselves twice just to make sure they're dead. I've always liked those suicides. Those are definitely legitimate suicide where a person shoots himself twice in the head just to make sure, after killing his family, of course. And that's, kind of the worst kind of punishment. But they'll say, you know what? Not only are we going to kill you, we're going to kill your family and blame it on you. They'll call it a murder-suicide. So I want you to think about all these things. This isn't, crazy conspiracy speak. This is applied political science in the 20th and the 21st centuries, as it has been practiced for the last God knows how many years. You think this only started, after the fall of the Soviet Union? No. These techniques and tactics have been around for hundreds of years, and they've been perfected and they've been improving. Okay. So, what does this bode for Georgia or any other country in the title of my article? Whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Moldova, whether it's Belarus, you should remember all former Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, right? Countries where attempts at color revolutions have been made, okay? And they're always made, for the sake of bringing democracy. By the way, democracy is great because it can be easily managed and manipulated through money. You buy up political parties, politicians, you buy up lobbyists, you buy up, as I've said, mass media, including entertainment media, who will make great films that are going to slowly propagandize the population into thinking that certain things are patriotic, which in fact they're not, right? And also going to paint a different version of events. I always love those movies that are made, after certain events, and they paint them in a particular light. You can tell that these movies were funded in part by, financial industrial groups with the involvement. They'll bring in as advisors, veterans of your foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs, veterans or consultants from your foreign intelligence or domestic security agencies. And they make the right movie with the right message to basically brainwash the population into accepting their version of events, right? Through fictional movies, not to mention all these, propaganda-like documentaries. Okay. So how are you going to resist this in Georgia, right? Let's say you're against this foreign agent law because you think it's going to limit the influence of the EU in Georgia. People, let's look at the foreign agent law that's being voted upon now in your parliament. It will probably be vetoed by your pro-Western president, and hopefully that veto will be overcome. Right? Very straightforward. The law states that you're a foreign agent if you receive, I think, more than 20% of your income from foreign sources. That means you have to declare it, right? So it's a way to de-anonymize people who are agents of influence by foreign powers. And when we talk about foreign powers, it's not just limited to foreign governments, because foreign influence isn't conducted just through government agencies, whether it's the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the State Department, whether it's through, the intelligence agency like the CIA in the US, or other government agencies like USAID, right? Agency for International Development. But then you look at what they do, right? So all these things you have to take into account that once you've got a foreign agent you're better off knowing who he is. That this person is on the payroll, let's say, of a foreign corporation. Because a foreign corporation will also and can be used to advance foreign interests. Or foreign association of, some industry, some producers. That can happen as well, right? Or we've seen all sorts of different funds, endowments. I'll just use the United States as an example. The National Endowment for Democracy. You've had, I think National Republican Institute, and they're all operating with federal money to politically influence local countries, and especially their youth, you guys, right? The youth and the future of Georgia into supporting American foreign policy interests. You guys may say, well, hey, we think that if we as Georgians support American foreign government interests, we'll be better off if we support, let's say, Russian foreign government interests or Azerbaijani, neighboring country with oil money, government interests, uh, or Turkish foreign government interests. My advice to you is this: you're better off having friendly relations with your neighbors. This has been, an unwritten rule since the beginning of time. Whether these are your physical individual neighbors if you're living in a village, right? Or whether it's someone else. But we're going to take a pause for a second and I'll finish this up. Sorry for the pause. There was a phone call I had to take. You're better off being in good relations with your neighbors. Okay. And also think about why someone, what's the expression? Beware of Greeks bearing gifts, right? Like the Trojan horse. Think about it. Why is the EU so interested in little Georgia? Okay. Is it interested in Georgia per se because it believes the addition of Georgia to the EU will drastically improve the lives and conditions of EU residents? No, it won't. Anytime the EU brings in a small, less developed country, what is it going to bring in? It's going to bring in a cheaper labor force that's going to apply wage pressure, right, to EU industries because residents of that country will be willing to work for less than Germans or French, right, or other members of the EU. So you have a cheaper labor force, which is advantageous for big business because it's all about the profit motive. The less you pay your employees, the more money you can make. More surplus labor, as Marx used to say, right? The other thing you do is you open up another market to sell your products. And it's very easy for EU giants to start dominating the Georgian market because they will come in and they'll price dump to make sure that the local competition is bankrupted out of business or they can simply buy it up cheaply. And it now belongs to them. And then they'll make up the money they lost on the price dumping and future profits once they control your market. Okay? So, like I said, it's when you bring in a small country, you're getting cheaper labor. You're getting an additional market for the sale of your products, right? You can create a lower cost manufacturing center, but that's not really been happening because people have realized along the way it's actually cheaper to buy Chinese goods and transport them from China, right? By rail, by sea, container ship, because in Chinese factories, no one's really concerned about employee rights as they would be in the EU in terms of labor protections. You can have more lax environmental standards, but more importantly, you're going to have cheap labor. People who are willing to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for $600 or 600 euros. They get free housing, they get free uniforms and free meals, and maybe a free football field to play at after work. But they're working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for $600 or 600 euros, sometimes even 500. And they're all very happy because they come from rural areas where it's a good way for them to escape the rural area, work for 5 years, save up most of the money because they're getting free meals and free housing and free uniforms, and then, move on. In the meantime, they're going to give their company 5 years of their lives. You're not going to be able to compete with Chinese workers like that and with Chinese goods manufactured with such cheaper labor. So, guess what? Even if you were to be invited into the EU, the opportunity you would get, and this is what most people fall for, is, hey man, we get to leave our country and go work somewhere else. We can work in England, we can work in Germany, we can work in Spain. Yeah, and what's going to happen to your country long term? What's going to happen to your country? Think of it, right? The EU is already suffering a population crisis because of affordability. Kids are expensive, right? People aren't having three, four, or more children. I've got 5 children. And your country is going to look at the Baltic states, right? Population starts to drop. Plus, your local culture kind of gets erased. Everyone's watching the same thing. Videos made by musicians from other countries, the US, Europe. No one's really going to be pushing for Georgian musicians or Georgian rap or things like that. You're going to be competing with huge movie manufacturing centers like Hollywood. Your local Tbilisi studio, movie studios that you had in the Soviet days are just not going to be able to compete. So you start to lose your culture. You also start to lose your language because Georgia's a small country, and what language are EU residents going to select to learn first and foremost? Is it going to be Georgian? Well, maybe some people who are linguistically curious, but mostly they're going to learn language of international business and trade, which happens to be English. Okay? So no one's learning Georgian. You're not going to get support of Georgian literature and things like that. You're also going to get pressure from the LGBT community. I don't know what your opinion is on LGBT rights, but for many people, from a strictly, kind of evil applied political point of view, the LGBT community is good because it aids population reduction. Right? Number one, aids population reduction. Number two, it's a stable, loyal, liberal electorate. So if you're pushing, these supposed liberal candidates that support your corporate agenda, then you can rely on the LGBT vote. The other thing that the LGBT movement does is it destroys the traditional institute of family. And, traditional institutes are dangerous to these transnational financial industrial groups because thanks to traditional institutes, people would be willing to resist some of these things that large corporations are pushing. In other words, if you're a father or mother, you'll do anything to protect your children. Let's say against uh, vaccines with complications, which could also be used in the population reduction program, right? Or just to make money from unnecessarily vaccinating kids, which then actually damages their immune system. But you can, read it on the internet. I'm not a physician, so I'm not going to give you a medical lecture on the pros and cons of vaccines or big pharma and all the pharmaceuticals that it pushes. So if you destroy the Institute of Family, then it's easier to manipulate the population. Just like if you destroy traditional institutes like religion. If you have the Georgian church, which is an autonomous church, Christian church, people who are its adherents will do things in the name of the church, in the name of their understanding of God and Jesus, and could resist certain things like, perhaps abortions. Abortions are also good for population reduction. It's a good thing. Why do I keep on saying population reduction? Because billionaires don't need, 7 or 8 billion population. They've already made their billions. They realize the more mouths we have to feed, the more you'll have to share with them. You'll make more money from robotization and automation, but then you're going to have to share that money with people who are going to be laid off work because their jobs are replaced by automated processes, robots, artificial intelligence, and etc. And billionaires aren't interested in sharing their wealth. That's the saddest thing I've learned in working with billionaires as a lawyer and as an investment advisor when I worked as an investment banker. Saddest, these people are extremely greedy. I've never understood that because I come from a modest family where, my maternal grandmother worked in a coal mine for 30 years till she retired in East Ukraine. And my mom was just never business oriented, right? And neither was my father. So, but billionaires aren't like that. So you need to think about this. That if you're interested as Georgians in protecting your sovereignty and your independence, support actions that will protect your country from foreign interference. So you say, okay, we need to enact laws that will prevent foreign money from funding Georgian political parties and Georgia's politicians. We need to enact laws that will protect foreign funding, will prevent or limit, or at least expose the foreign funding of Georgian non-governmental and nonprofit organizations, even religious organizations, because religion, sadly enough, is used as a tool. Okay? If the Georgian church cannot be used to push their agenda, other churches will be brought into Georgia that will push their agenda. Okay? Think about this. Religion has also been used as a tool. So you also want to pass laws that will prevent foreign investment, foreign control, and foreign ownership of Georgia's entertainment and mass media. Because when you have foreign investment, ownership, and control, especially of news media, then guess what? You're not going to have the news media, the journalists, functioning as an independent fourth estate that's supposed to help you control your government by making everything transparent, by exposing any corruption, by exposing any incompetence, right? Or any abuse of authority. Journalists can also be like politicians. They can also be like prostitutes. Sadly enough, even honest people who go into journalism can be corrupted with money, where they realize that they'll make more money, they'll have a better career writing about what they're told or suggested to write, as opposed to writing the truth or exposing all sorts of different things. So you don't want foreign involvement in your journalism. You also don't want foreign involvement in your government agencies. Okay? You don't want foreign involvement in your labor unions. They're not there to help. Okay? They may be there to actually reduce ineffectiveness your local unions that can protect the labor rights of Georgians, of Georgian employees. Okay? You want your political system, right, to be sovereign, independent, and accountable to Georgians. So you have politicians that are going to help you develop Georgia, develop its industry, right, given globalization. So you have to think about what industries can be competitive, right? Whether it's IT, whether it's agriculture, whether it's tourism, whatever, right? But you have to think of Georgia first. When you have such an onslaught of all these supposed do-gooders opposing the foreign agent law, that's telling you that these individuals are there to make sure they have foreign agents in Georgia who are going to, they're agents of influence. Basically, they're spies, they're puppets who are going to do their bidding. And it's not going to be to Georgia's benefit. Okay? And by the way, Russia is a boogeyman. Look, I was born in Moscow. I've lived half of my life in Russia. I've also spent the first 4 years of my life in Ukraine, East Ukraine, Donbass. I speak Ukrainian as well, in addition to Russian and to English and some Spanish and some German. I've lived in Austria and some Hebrew. But don't fall for the Russian boogeyman. Russia is the biggest country in the world in terms of landmass, with all the natural resources. Russia's natural resources are valued at $75 trillion. Okay? $75 trillion. It's number one in the world. in the value of natural resources. So, as you may suspect, right, these individuals, these financial industrial groups, would love to get a hold of Russia's natural resources and key lucrative, profitable Russian industries. Think about all the gold, all the diamond mining, nickel, platinum, palladium, iron ore, coal deposits, oil, gas deposits. And these international financial industrial groups would love to participate in those profits. So what's preventing them? Well, what they've encountered is encountered a Russian government led by President Putin, who said, well, wait a minute, guys, this is our country, you know. Putin is a former KGB officer who worked in the foreign intelligence division of the KGB. In other words, he wasn't, you know, chasing dissidents around us. So he was doing foreign intelligence in Germany. He knows how this game works, no worse than people in Langley or people at MI6. And he understands how financial industrial groups control Western governments. And so the approach of the Putin team is very easy. To our country, you know, if you want to participate, you're going to do it on our terms. And we have the ability to ensure our sovereignty and independence. Notice what happened with post-Soviet Russia after Yeltsin transferred his power to Putin at the end of 1999. The eventual cooling of relations, because once President Putin started to put his loyal followers in key government agencies, and also started to deal with Russian oligarchs who ended up getting government Soviet state assets pennies on the dollar through corrupt privatization auctions, the Putin team just made very clear rules. If you're an oligarch and you're going to try to apply the Western model of trying to control our financial system, we're not going to let you, right? And one of the first people to fall was Khodorkovsky, right, the founder of Yukos, because apparently he tried to interfere in the political system by influencing Russian legislators into not passing a law that would basically prevent transfer pricing of oil exports, but instead would basically charge a flat excise tax for every barrel of oil exported. So you couldn't try to lower the price and get most of the profits abroad. But that's a different story. So what I want you to understand is, right now, Georgia, as a small neighbor of Russia, can end up being a pawn, just like Ukraine, that was being used to apply pressure to Russia to get Russia under control. And you don't get a country under control for nothing. You get it under control because you can make money off it, right? From its natural resources, also from its human resources. Because human resources are, like I've said before, a cheap source of labor, right? Or you can get talented, well-educated human resources in key scientific fields. We're going to create inventions for you, and you can make more money from, and things like that, right? You also get a huge market. Russia is the biggest country in Europe, 140 million people. That's a huge consumer market, right? That if you get rid of all these Russian protectionist measures, you can wipe out Russian domestic industry or bring it under control, buy it up for pennies on a dollar. And then you have this huge market. I mean, think of it. Moscow, with its suburbs, around 17 million. This is the biggest city in Europe. If you've never been to Moscow, visit Moscow and see what it's like. The infrastructure, the clean public transportation, efficient cellular and internet communications, clean streets, electric buses, very little street crime, no homeless, no alcoholics or drug addicts running around, no ghettos like you see in American cities, which breaks my heart as an American, right? I've grew up in Philadelphia, worked as a police officer in Philadelphia, went to Columbia University in New York, lived a bunch of years in New York, also have an office in Washington, D.C. And I look at all those cities and I'm sad to see what's been happening to them, okay? So as Georgians, you don't want to turn your country into a pressure point in these Western financial industrial groups' attempts to control Russia. The other reason you have to control Russia, aside from its natural resources, its human resources, its technology, I mean, think about all the efficient, good Russian weaponry, right? Or the space program. Remember, Russia is a huge land bridge between Europe and Asia. Okay. So the transit of goods from Asian manufacturing centers, whether it's India, whether it's China, right, to Europe can quickly be done by rail or now through the Northern Sea Passage, which is a lot shorter than, bringing stuff by ship uh, around India, through the Suez Canal, or around the Horn of Africa, things like that. So it's another reason. But the biggest reason of all is, remember, large financial industrial groups want to do two things. Once they've become large financial industrial groups, their stakeholders, who are always individuals, right? Uh, Behind every company, every fund, there are individual beneficiaries, often families, right? Or groups of people who are, on a friendly basis, right? I guess law enforcement would call them co-conspirators. But anyway, these individuals realize that the biggest threat is now coming from China because you have 1.5 billion Chinese. Chinese has now become the industrial center of the world, right? But what does China lack? China lacks raw materials and energy carriers like oil and gas, uh, plus also, food. So how do you control China? Because remember, as China expands, what is a country do? A country is also going to promote its local financial industrial groups, right? In other words, Chinese financial industrial groups are going to start selling and making money from countries that establish relations with China in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas. So that's going to slowly push out the influence of Western financial industrial groups. It's going to cost them money. So China is the number one future enemy, but China is unbeatable as long as Russia remains its independent junior partner or junior ally, because Russia can provide China with everything that it lacks, not just the land bridge, but also agricultural products, food. Right, Russia's a major food exporter. Look at all the Russian grain exports, right? Oil and gas, which is critical, right? Coal, if necessary, plus the military protection, right? Russia's military, Russia's nuclear weapon stockpile, which is the biggest in the world, right? Russia's space program. The Chinese already have their space station. And with the participation of Russians, they can even go further. So this is why things are developing so fast and are so critical today, because Western financial industrial groups are facing a serious threat from China, and they know they will not be able to handle this threat as long as China has Russia as its junior ally, right? With Siberia. Siberia is just a godsend, right? Forget about world overpopulation. Half of China could move to Russia, and Russians probably wouldn't even feel it if they all mostly moved to east of the Ural Mountains, right? There's so much land space. Now, you'll also notice that pressure is now being severely applied to other independent countries that have strategic exports. And that's Iran, because it's an oil exporter, major military power, and soon to be nuclear power. And it's also Venezuela, right? Venezuela, look at all the proven or suspected oil reserves that they found in Venezuela. It's incredible. And Venezuela has nationalized its oil industry. You said, yeah, but Venezuelans are living poorly. Not because of the nationalization. They're living poorly just like Cubans because of U.S. sanctions. Because Western financial industrial groups, they've always been afraid of socialism and communists. What do socialists and communists do? They come and they take away the wealth from the wealthy, and they distribute it among the poor. Billionaires, you ask a billionaire here, hey, give up one tenth of your income. We'll send all that money to schools in Africa, fight hunger. And if you try to take that 1/10 away from him, he'll wipe out your entire family if he has to with private contractors. That's the type of greed. That's why in the Christian New Testament they have a saying. What's attributed to Jesus? Where it says, "It's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of the needle than for a rich man to enter the paradise, the kingdom of heaven." Because it's a totally different mindset. The kingdom of heaven is when you're oriented to do good, treat everyone as equal brothers and things like that. So getting back to this foreign agent law. Listen, I'm not promoting Russian interests, okay? Russia does not need Georgia, guys. The beaches are nice. Tbilisi is a wonderful place. Batumi is a wonderful place. I remember vacationing in Suhumi when I was a little kid. My grandmother actually worked in Suhumi before World War II started, and so did her sister. They got married there. So I have a great relation towards Georgia. And I sincerely hope you can resolve your ethnic conflicts with Abkhazians and with Ossetians. But I don't think these guys want to be a part of Georgia. So you have to let them go. People are entitled to self-determination. I'm a big fan of that too, right? That people should have a right to self-determination. The problem that we run into with self-determination is when a bigger country says, well, wait a minute, if these small entities become independent, they're going to be used by our enemies to try to get us under control. And that creates an issue. Okay. So I'm sorry for the 56-minute lecture, but take the time to listen to this. Share this with your friends. Okay. And all these great slogans, glory to Ukraine, glory to Georgia. Listen, these are all fascist slogans from back in the day. Don't fall for that crap. You really don't. Okay. And screw Russia. What did Russia do to you? Oh, Russia supported the Ossetians when we tried to take them over by force. Russian peacekeepers prevented an ethnic cleansing in South Ossetia, right? That Saakashvili started. And do you think Saakashvili would have done anything without the approval of the U.S. State Department or the CIA or the White House? Saakashvili was a typical agent of foreign influence that was completely controlled by his American handlers, period. Just like today, we have President Zelensky, who's completely controlled by his foreign handlers, and look where it has gotten Ukraine. You don't want to turn your country into Ukraine, right? Remember how the war and why the war started in Ukraine in 2022. Because in 2021, Russian intelligence and Russia's armed forces received information that Ukrainians were planning to take the Donetsk and the Lugansk People's Republics by force, with the support and full approval and assistance of Ukraine's NATO partners, basically the US and its allies. So what happened afterwards? Russia clearly in the open made proposals to the US and to NATO where they said, look, number one, you're not fulfilling the Minsk agreements. Ukraine never wanted to fulfill the Minsk agreements because what would you do? If you fulfilled the Minsk agreements, you'd have an East Ukrainian pro-Russian electorate that would be completely, they would get immunity, right, from prosecution, completely pardoned. You'd have decentralization. In other words, local authorities in East Ukraine and Donbass would be able to elect their own officials, would be able to elect their own laws, and obviously protect the use of the Russian language and the Russian Eastern Orthodox Church, things like that, and heavily influence the rest of the Ukrainian population. Plus, they would let the Ukrainian population know how the Ukrainian armed forces committed serious war crimes during 2014. So in 2021, Russia tells NATO and the US, Ukraine has to fulfill the Minsk agreement. You have to agree that Ukraine is going to be neutral status, will never become a NATO member. It's not going to have NATO bases, right? It's not going to have NATO troops on its soil. And then you guys are not going to try to grab Crimea back, because as far as we're concerned, Crimea has always been Russian. Yes, Khrushchev, under his initiative, Khrushchev, by the way, a guy from Ukraine, just like Brezhnev, a guy from Ukraine, right? These are Soviet leaders. Look them up. Transferred Crimea to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. He said for administrative reasons or on behalf of Ukrainian friendship. There were actually other reasons why he transferred. We'll talk about that in another video. It's pretty sad why they did it. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Crimeans had referendums where they said, we'd rather be in Russia. That much for the right of people to self-determination. So Georgians, do the right thing, support foreign agent law, prevent foreign interference in your government affairs. Because if the financial industrial groups that are behind EU, NATO governments decide to take over your country, they will do it through agents of influence by allocating $5 billion, $10 billion, and you as regular Georgians will be able to do nothing about it. Right? These politicians will pass laws that you won't be able to challenge no matter how many times you storm your parliament. Right? Your army and your law enforcement officers will undergo training to quickly quell civil unrest. And if necessary, they'll shoot. Okay? And these people are going to do everything to the benefit of their corporate financial interests. And if they have to use Georgia to destabilize Russia or to try to weaken Russia, just like Ukraine, they'll do it. They'll turn your country into a pawn and, heaven forbid, a battlefield. Not to mention, I'm going to save the best for last, because the scariest thing, guys, isn't nuclear weapons. The scariest thing is biological weapons. And thanks to that biological weapons lab that the U.S. Department of Defense has set up in Georgia, these people aren't just testing pathogens, natural occurring pathogens. They're testing things through gains of function research, also be able to weaponize them and to use them. Is that what you want? Because remember, this is like opening a Pandora's box. Okay? So instead of, chanting on the square, hey, let's not expose foreign agents and let's not expose foreign influence. If you want to protect your country's independence and the safety of your future generations and your current residents, shut down that biolab and take away the diplomatic immunity of the people who run it. I may be an American, but I'm against bioweapons research. I've been involved in biotech. I know all this stuff, and I've walked away from it because I did not want to have this on my conscience. Any potential dual use stuff. So do the right thing. Thank you for your time.